Hey everybody, it's Evan here, and today I'm giving you the video recording of a presentation that I did about a month ago, and the topic is disruption. And I think we can all kind of relate because all of our daily lives have been completely disrupted by this COVID-19 thing. Every one of our 350 people at HMC are now working from home, and everybody everywhere is at home now. So we kind of all have a feeling about what that's like. But the topic of this talk is really about how technology is disrupting the profession of architecture and the AEC industry at large. And I think something that I also am now thinking about since giving that lecture is that a lot of businesses and people are all talking about getting back to business as normal, right? Business as usual. What's it going to be like? How long is it going to be until we get back to that? And we have the opportunity for it not to go back to business as usual and to be normal ever again. We actually have a unique opportunity right now because of the situation that we're in to hit the reset button on so many things that we do. So as you watch this presentation and as you kind of think about the topics that I'm presenting here, a lot of those are coming from Clayton Christensen's book on disruption and from the Susskind's book called The Future of the Professions. I hope that you'll think about even more so how technology, especially as we're now super reliant on it for day-to-day connectivity and just person-to-person business as we're all kind of isolated away, you can really think about how business is going to change and how you can have a direct effect on making it better. So I think there's so many things that we could be thinking about, whether it comes to how we deliver the services that we do via paper. I mean, maybe we can get rid of that even sooner. I have a video actually all about how the paper deliverable must die. I'll add a little card up here in the corner so you can click on that and see that video too. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this presentation on disruption. I'm also going to be talking about a lot of things in here that are not necessarily disruptive technologies, but they are definitely new entrants and things to watch in the field. They're just too early to tell for a lot of these still. So I hope you enjoy it. Go ahead and leave a comment below to keep the conversation going. I'd love to hear what you think about it. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that little notification bell down below so that you can see when my next video comes out. All right, hope you enjoy it. See you later. Bye. Welcome. I think I'm gonna get started so that I make sure that we have enough time. So as other people filter in, welcome them too. So cue the ominous music here, and thanks for coming to the next installment in my emerging technology lecture series. And this one is a little bit different. It's not about a specific technology. It's more about this concept of disruption. And I'm going to talk about what disruption is. So I want to define it for you real quick because a lot of people think of, and even I did this quite a while ago, was just thought that disruption refers to a dramatic breakthrough in any certain field. And that's definitely not the case because there's actually a theory behind disruption. I'm going to be talking about also just innovative technologies that aren't necessarily disruption. But I wanted to talk about the idea of what disruption was because I think it's something we should all be thinking about when we're working in this profession, right? Because I do believe that disruption truly is happening and there's lots of ways that it's happening. It's not just going to be one thing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the theory up front. So it's a theory of competitive response where products that target the same customers as existing players are called sustaining innovations, right? So if somebody were to be a direct competitor of ours, they're just considered sustaining innovators. Maybe they're doing innovative things, but they're not necessarily disrupting what we're doing. An example of that would be like Uber. Uber is not disruptive to the taxi service, and a lot of people think it is. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to point it out right in the beginning is because, and we'll get into the reasons why specifically, but it's while it is taking business away from taxis, it's not doing it in a disruptive way. All right, so we'll talk kind of about the distinction between that. So one of the rules for disruptors is that they have to be cheap. It has to be a cheap new entrant into it has to be inferior, actually, in a way. So that's where things get a little tricky, right? It's because we don't think of like an Uber ride is not inferior to a taxi ride, and it didn't start out that way. When we're thinking about our competitors and them doing innovative things, they're not offering an inferior service that we are or an inferior product that we are, and that's where the actual word disruption, the theory of disruption, gets a little, you have to go a little deeper than what it is at the surface. So typically, because those products are so inferior and they are cheap, they chip away at a customer base, and it happens so much over time that they're kind of flying under the radar of these established companies. Right? So because they're taking away customers that aren't necessarily your customers anymore, and they're growing that business rapidly because of technology, all of a sudden they're a major player and you didn't see it coming. And that's really how disruption happens. All right? Where a lot of this comes from is from this book, The Innovator's Dilemma, written by Clayton Christensen. So I'm not presenting any new ideas here. I'm just really disseminating some of what's been written about and what has been observed. I think one of the other interesting things about disruptive technologies or companies is that it really has to be studied over time. It can't just be something that you notice right away, right? So you might think a company's disruptive or a technology is disruptive, but you really can't know for quite a while. And so one of the things that Clayton Christensen points out in this book, and I think this is where it starts to get really, where it hits home for us as architects, is he actually in this book demonstrates how successful, outstanding companies can do everything quote unquote right, and still lose their market leadership or even fail as new, unexpected competitors rise and take over the market. All right, so I think that to me is like the most frightening thing about it, is you think you're doing so many things well, and this disruption still happens to you. So basically, he states that every successful and established company will one day be overtaken and threatened by a revolutionary newcomer, right? So we basically are talking about two different categories of businesses. We're talking about incumbents, that's us, right? That's many companies out there. The companies that have been around for a long time have built really great relationships with clients, offer amazing services and products. And then we're talking about the new entrants into the field that are the ones who are kind of flying under the radar. Maybe you know about them, maybe you don't. And so they're the revolutionary newcomers. And so today, disruption is used to justify any and every innovation coming out of the tech sector, right? But growing quickly and being disruptive are not the same thing. All right, so just because a company gets a lot of VC backing and they have a lot of capital and all of a sudden they're raising a ton of millions and millions of dollars through Series A and Series B round, it doesn't mean that they're disruptive, right? It just means somebody's giving them a lot of money to hopefully return on that investment. All right, so I'm going to admit that some of the, I've already said this a little bit, but some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is disruptive, and some of it we don't know yet, and some of it just isn't, but it's all kind of interesting things to be aware of that are happening in and around architecture, and I'm going to be giving examples of lots of other types of companies and how they're being disrupted, and we'll do some fun stuff in between. So basically, established companies in their markets succeed by listening to their customers. All right, so think about HMC, think about the firm that we work in at this point. At some point, they deliver a product that is good enough for most of their customers. In their pursuit of growth, they listen to their most valuable and demanding customers. And what they build becomes more and more powerful and more expensive, right? So we see this happening all over the place, right? So then a technological advancement allows some new entrant to come in and serve the same market, okay? Not necessarily the same clients, but the same market. So it's operating within the same domain, all right? And that new entrant serves the people that don't need the big product, right? So the entrant's customers are not our customers necessarily, okay? But they're within the same domain, right? They have different needs. They make a worse product, and it actually is able to evolve quickly because of technology, and they come in and start to build up that base. And it improves, and because it's worse, it improves rapidly, right? So because they're constantly getting feedback, right? And improving that. And it's the lower price, typically because of technology. It comes in, captures more and more of the market, and because the existing companies only have the highest end of the market, it's super expensive, it's super complicated. This low-end product starts to take away the market from underneath that established company. All right. So the technological change is key to this theory as well. It's always kind of sparked by that technological innovation. If you're just a cheap product, that is also not disruptive, right? Because by the time you become as full-featured as the existing product, you're going to cost the same. All right, so cheapness doesn't necessarily matter here. And so you look at these kind of 4 different trajectories, and then you see what disruptive technology, how it's able to kind of surpass all of those quickly because of those factors. Technology, cheap, low quality, but then they're constantly iterating and making it better and better and better very quickly. All right. So how do good established businesses fail? So businesses and managers within those businesses can fail by doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And that to me is probably the most scary thing, right? Because especially as architects, we traditionally take on the next project and approach it the same way we did the last project, right? Maybe we get a little bit better, but that's what we're supposed to do, right? And what's funny is in the book, he actually says that their mistake is serving their customers well. And I think, whoa, well, what are you supposed to do then, right? And it's not that they're doing things wrong, but because they're doing things right, they're putting themselves in an uncompetitive position. And some sort of paradigm change comes and they don't see it coming, right? So this is one of the reasons why we see a lot of startups succeed. Actually, we probably only hear about the ones that really succeed, right? There's a lot of startups that fail too. But when you think about an entrant, you might think about it in relative terms to a startup because we hear that so much. So how do these new entrants or how do these startups succeed? So something in their core model shifts. And the core virtue of a startup is that it can adapt quickly and take advantage of a situation that a large company can't, right? So we have a certain momentum. A lot of people I hear in large firms talk about steering the big ship and how hard it is to do that, right? And so by nature, big companies get locked into ways of doing things, right? And they can't respond quickly to those changes that are happening in the marketplace or with what their customers want. And startups don't just beat struggling companies, right? They beat successful companies. And I think that's probably the thing that is the most alarming about this, and we should be very aware of that it's happening. All right, so quick example here, Motel 6 and the Ritz-Carlton. So is Motel 6 disruptive to the Ritz-Carlton brand? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? Okay, so Motel 6 is cheap, right? They've been around for a long time. They've got, showing a couple different options of kind of what, I didn't even know Motel 6s could look like this on the right. What's interesting about this is if, here's some pictures of the Ritz-Carlton. If you're Motel 6, you're actually not disruptive to the Ritz-Carlton, right? Because if you wanted to provide the same luxuries and services the Ritz does, you would have to charge Ritz prices to do it, right? So not an example of disruption. All right, so on the other hand, you probably know where this is going, right? Like we'd look at Airbnb versus Ritz-Carlton as far as technology goes. We'll just look at a few rooms here that you can see in various Ritz-Carltons, right? Very nice, super clean, nice daylight. And then we look at kind of like here's an image from an Airbnb landing page, very different kind of a space, right? So they're not trying to be the Ritz-Carlton, right? But because of a technological change, Airbnb basically created a platform that commoditizes trust that you don't need, because that is one of the things about Ritz, right? You go to a Ritz and you have that trust. Airbnb has done that by creating a platform with a rating system, a two-way rating system, and you start to build that trust, right? They've got super hosts and all of those kinds of things. But they also start competing on completely different vectors than Ritz-Carlton does, right? So you want a kitchen, you want a backyard, you want a barbecue, right? You want access to I don't know, like a dog park. Like Airbnbs can be anywhere. Ritz-Carltons are only where Ritz-Carltons are. So they have a very limited supply of locations, and Airbnbs can be absolutely anywhere. So these are the things that make it competitive in a way that Ritz-Carlton cannot respond to, right? There's no way, right? And it's not that Ritz-Carlton necessarily feels affected by this, but the hotel industry as a whole definitely does, right? And I'm sure Ritz does feel some of that. So at the start, Airbnb, it's funny because they allowed you to just sleep on an air mattress in somebody's living room. Like that's how it actually started, right? So talking about that low cost, low barrier to entry, inferior product by all means, right? You could rent this is an actual Airbnb listing, this picture here. This was in London, and they ended up taking it down. Airbnb got rid of it off their site, but you could get this. This was called a private room in a public space, and it was $15 a night, right? And the cheapest anything else was $20 a night, right? But then you start to look at this kind of stuff, right? It's like, well, man, I could stay in a castle, right? I could stay in a windmill. It's a low-cost solution, but provides amazing value to the customer, right? Here's a tree house, and then here's like a seashell house. It's pretty interesting. So over time, the quality obviously has increased, right? They've followed kind of this disruptive model of starting at super low end, like couch surfing almost, right? And then they've gotten to the point where, and I mean, I've used this all over the world. It's amazing what you can get. There's also some horror stories, right, for Airbnb, but for the most part, they have created a platform of trust, and it is a very popular thing. And so as they do begin to address the needs of higher value customers that would otherwise stay at a nice hotel, the Ritz-Carlton is a very asset-heavy business, and it really can't compete. Back to this book. Basically, Christensen's book writes down the formula for how this happens because it's a pattern. It happens in a systematic fashion. We see it happen again and again, and particularly for the first wave of technology, right? The internet was like the catalyzing moment for a lot of these things to be enabled to happen. So new entrants develop that crappy product that competes with the big guys and slowly, over time, make it better so it eventually beats them, right? That's the basic formula, right? So I think what's interesting about that is that most industries look at these as a series of flukes, but there is actually a pattern. So one of the examples that he cites in the book is mainframe computers, right? So that's a mainframe. This was a mini computer when they came out, right? It's pretty terribly misnamed because these are the size larger than a refrigerator, right? But that's what replaced mainframes. And then we got to personal computers, right? Also kind of terribly named. Now looking back, I think what's interesting is that each of these kind of new technologies that came along to replace the old one were first looked at as toys, right? You couldn't do serious work on those. You couldn't do anything that would, they're for hobbyists and for people with neckbeards, right? They're nerds in caves that stay up all night and code video games, right? And now, like, this is on everybody's desk. It's actually in everybody's pocket, right? So it's funny when these things come out, they get panned. They get panned by the pundits. They get panned by the people who are the establishment. We look at these new technologies that come along, it's like, oh, well, that'll never take away, they'll never compete with what I'm doing, right? And then it ends up, they actually just completely replace what you're doing. They don't compete with it, they replace it. One of the interesting things about this is that it really does happen over and over again. And it happens, it's happened in our business as well. We look at like hand drawing went to, this is the very first like CAD system, right? But we can see how the pencil has become digitized over time. And there was, when we switched from pencil to AutoCAD, it was in a glass room in the corner, and it was very special and expensive, and only a few operators were allowed to go in there and do it. And then we switched from, AutoCAD, everybody Basically what AutoCAD did was make it so that anybody could draw a nice looking drawing, right? You didn't have to have special training. And then Revit came along and everyone's like, oh, well, you know, that's a lot more work. I got to do it all in 3D now. And basically it's this evolution. So none of those are really disruptive technologies. They're more evolution kind of things. One of this one here, I think, is probably one of the most interesting is the iPhone versus cell phones. And this is actually one of the ones that Christensen got wrong, was that he originally thought that, you know, the iPhone came out, it's expensive. It's more expensive than any cell phone out there, right? It's coming in at the high end of the market. It was advanced ahead of the pack, but eventually that market would catch up and, you know, be commoditized and everyone would buy the cheaper version. What really happened was that the iPhone was up against computers, but nobody knew it. And why didn't they know it? Because it was called the iPhone, right? It was like the red herring. Nobody suspected that it was competing against computers. But initially, you think about it, like the iPhone was cheaper than high-end computers, right? People just used it to play video games on. Like the software was pretty crappy, the screen was small, the resolution was low. It was all these things that it didn't compete with on computers. But, you know, once everybody kind of figured it out and it got better and better and better over time, and now, like, imagine your life without it, right? Now look how much time has been replaced on this small screen versus what used to be spent on a large screen, right? So that, I think, is something, because this is the true, all of these things on the screen right now are the true personal computers, right? They are very personal. They're yours, they're in your pocket, they're on your body, they're wearable, like these AirPods. They're computers in your ears, right? So very interesting, I think, as far as a disruption theory kind of an idea. So the high end of the market now is pushed even higher. Like, this is a computer you can buy today, and that's how much money you could spend on it. Right now, that's not necessarily a computer we're going to buy to do our work, but it really has pushed the PC market to the very high end. People are doing very high end things on computers now because you have this other device that has come in and taken away the market of all of those other smaller things. So all the communication, the email, the messaging, you know, I do a lot of drawing on my iPad. It's replaced my computer on a lot of different levels. But you basically have now gotten to the point where you don't replace your computer every couple of years. You replace it as often as you replace a microwave, maybe, right? Whereas the new cell phone, it's every couple of years, and you really actually look forward to it because the advancements come along. The new camera, like, I've got to have that new camera, right? It's the best camera that I have. So people really look forward to that technology versus you never look forward to replacing this technology anymore, right? So let's play a little bit of disruption Jeopardy. All right, I thought this would kind of be fun. All right, so I have some different categories here for you guys, and this isn't going to be, I haven't like fully programmed a full-on Jeopardy board here. All right, guys. But what I want to ask is, like, what is the incumbent that's being disrupted here? So I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to allow you guys to run wild on the Jeopardy board here. Who wants?
She's so excited.
Okay, which one? Which category, Christina, do you want to go for?
Let's do we're living in a material world for 400.
All right. Spoiler alert, I only have one per category. All right, so we're living in a material world, and so I'm gonna go down here. Okay, so this incumbent has been virtually replaced with peer-to-peer technology that enables two-way encrypted exchange that will make you green with envy. Who is the incumbent that's being disrupted?
Monetary system?
Yeah, like.
Cryptocurrency?
Can you please answer in the form of a question? Yeah, so yeah, we're talking about like the payments, the finance system, right? So examples would be Venmo, Square Cash, right? Things like that, right? Where you don't need to go to a bank anymore. You don't need to go to an ATM. You can just do it peer to peer, right? All right, do I have another one? Anybody want to take a different category? I see.
Neither here nor there.
Neither here nor there. All right, so this incumbent has been disrupted by online platforms that search across multiple vendors and personal offerings for their next big adventure.
I should know travel. What is like the travel industry?
Yes. Ding, 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 ding. Right. All right. So Kayak, Hipmunk, Expedia, right? Airbnb, right? So now I don't need to go to a travel agent. I can book direct. Removal of the middleman in a lot of these cases. All right. So a couple other examples. So the very first one, a shift towards rapid reskilling and unbundled models has the potential to reach people whose needs are not being met by traditional models of this incumbent.
What is cable TV?
No?
No?
Good guess. I like that. That's might fit that question, but that answer. But in this case, talking about education, right? So you can get free education online, right, through all of these different platforms. So Khan Academy, iTunes University, things like that. And then let's see. Well, let's just go to the next one. So here's different examples. So education, travel, payments, retail, right? So when we're talking about again, these aren't all necessarily disruptive, but definitely some of them are. A lot of them are, they're all enabled by technology. A lot of them have created platforms that have disintermediated somebody else, right? So taken away the need for a middleman. So travel agents, right, gone. Very interesting set of examples here. All right, so another kind of vector that plays into this is the future of the profession. So this is a book that I've been reading. There's a lot of really interesting information in this book about the future of all professions, whether that would be law or accounting, or things where you would go to receive professional services. Architecture is definitely one of them. They started off this father and son team studying the law sector because that's where they come from, and then as they were lecturing and talking about this, they kept getting other professionals coming up and being like, we see the same thing. And basically their thesis was that technology is allowing disintermediation of gatekeepers, right? So what are you going to do? There are basically two possible outcomes for you. You will either continue to evolve slowly and iterate over time and get a little bit more efficient, or you will have to radically transform. And so we're seeing the disintermediation of the gatekeepers time and time again, right, in all of these categories. So there is a lot of movement going on because of technology. We're seeing the transportation industry change substantially, right? We're seeing it from rideshare, but we're also seeing it from autonomous vehicles, right? We're seeing it from the total shift to electric vehicles. We're seeing it in health. Instead of going to a doctor, you look up WebMD, right? You, instead of going to a lawyer to get your LLC stuff, you go to LegalZoom, right? So we're seeing this happen time and time again because of technology, and mostly because of the internet, but also because of connected devices, always on internet of things. We're seeing it in the music industry. What happened when iTunes came along? Like the record industry freaked out, right? We see Netflix come along. Who did they displace? Blockbuster, right? So we didn't need to worry about late fees anymore, right? Keep the disc as long as you want, right? So completely upended existing businesses. So the common thread is definitely technology. And so I want to now start to shift to talk about architecture. So this right here is a McKinsey study, and it's the digitization index. And it looks at all these different categories. There's education, there's utilities, oil and gas, media. The ones who are highly digitized are at the top. The ones that are not highly digitized are at the bottom. And look where we are, right? We're right there. What's really interesting is watch how this contrasts with the next. So look what's right below construction, right? Agriculture. So if you start to look at the Bureau of Labor and Statistics and how productivity has gained in all other industries as an average against construction, productivity has actually gone down over the last, let's just call it 50 years. You can see that it is actually starting to trend upward down here, but only slightly back toward where it started, right? So kind of scary. And then this is what I was talking about as being interesting, is look where agriculture is. on this one, which this one is basically gross value added. This is the innovation curve of these. Innovation for agriculture, right? GPS, robotics, all of the automation that's happening on farming and through the whole food production versus construction, right? So this is where we start to kind of think, and this image has been around for a long time. I believe it was originally made by a company called Case, and basically the idea was that buildings equal data. We don't necessarily treat it that way in our industry as a whole. The shift is beginning to happen, and this is really where the disruption in our industry is happening, is that buildings have a wealth of data in them as they continue to operate over time, especially. And typically our relationship ends when our drawings are delivered, and then we go on and we start over again, right? We don't necessarily, we're not part of the process of learning in that relationship beyond that point where all of the data actually is accumulated in how buildings are occupied and operated over time. So design in the digital age, we're talking about things like automation, coded knowledge, digital and distributed manufacturing, and then the widespread data collection of how buildings actually perform. So these technologies make it possible to distribute design knowledge at real time and near zero cost, right? So that's really what technology, how it's disrupting what architecture is doing, is because, again, it's kind of disintermediating us as the gatekeeper of that professional knowledge. So there's tools being developed that just allow anybody to operate, right? You don't have to be an architect. There's startups happening where you can run your building check against a code compliance, right? So a lot of new entrants and arrivals in design technology, and here's a few of them. So if we start to look at the digital regulators, companies like Upcode's taking that on. This is what Upcode's website looks like, AI for building code automation, right? They're trying to take away or that part of the process, make it easier, but also, I would say, getting more people involved in that code process along the building, on that project timeline. But having the computer look for problems, right? Instead of having somebody who's trained to look for those problems, who could still potentially miss, but find them. Interoperability platforms, so getting the design to not have to be redrawn between stages of the process, right? So interoperability from conceptual design to production. Full stack, so these are companies that kind of do it all, right? We're talking about they design it, they build it, they operate it, they collect the data, they make the process better the next time, and they continually do that over and over and over again. Katerra is more of a building manufacturing side. They design it, they build it, they're not necessarily operating it, but they are collecting data, and they've cut a lot of fat out of the process, especially out of the construction waste process. Here's a quick video of the Katerra. This is cross-laminated timber factory. I think this is in Tracy, California. But just a couple of quick minutes here to show kind of the volume that they're operating at. And so this is specifically looking at these CLT panels that they've come up with. It's cross-laminated timber, so they're showing the volume, and you can see how automated this plant is, right? So contractors are moving to this model. I toured 2 prefab plants last week in Phoenix. Katerra was not one of them. But they're looking at ways at reducing most of the waste out of the construction process. This company in particular is designing these panelized systems that they can then use as a module and design buildings around that exact module. So they've come up with these 12 by 60 panels that they then cut into 4 parts. They can be horizontal, they can be vertical, and they're really getting into the mass timber industry. And what's really interesting is right now, building codes are changing to allow bigger, taller buildings to be built out of timber. So it's kind of like this perfect inflection point that they're hitting on. And a question came up during a panel that I was sitting in on. It was like, well, what do you guys think about how architects are going to fit into this? And the guy, he was an architect, and he was just like, he danced around that question. But like the real answer is, I don't care what happens to architects, right? That's not my business model. My business model is not keeping architects in business. So they're not replacing everything, but they are. Look at this giant, this is on Washington University, Washington campus up there, and I think that's in Seattle. So a timber building, beautiful, and very, I think, disruptive to our industry on some levels. They're definitely not competing at the low cost side of things, but they're definitely coming in with speed, quality control, reduction waste. And so just think about that for a minute, all right? So on the visualization side of things, there's lots of really interesting things happening. I'm going to show a quick little example of Archeo. So this is Noah. He's right here in the lower right-hand corner in our Sacramento office, basically building in VR, right? So he's going through and building the model. You can build it from the bird's eye view. You can jump down to the street view. You can build it in one-to-one. Really incredible software. And what's really cool about it is that you can have multiple people in the software at the same time, either as watchers or participants. All right, so multiple people can be actually getting in the model with you and participating in the process, or they can be watching along on an iPad. Some other bespoke software tools. So you might have, I do have a post on our intranet about this tool. This was shown a few years ago at Autodesk University, but basically using generative design and algorithms to kind of find the sweet spot with a bunch of different criteria. So they're looking at daylight, they're looking at buzz, they're looking at thermal comfort, they're looking at layouts for circulation, all of these things at the same time, and letting these algorithms kind of, again, find the sweet spot between where all of those different constraints collide and get them what they want. And it's a very kind of interactive design process with the computer to kind of define, based on data, what the best outcome could be, which is a lot different than how we might approach doing a furniture layout inside of an office, right? Which would be very grid-based because the office is already on a grid. I think that's something that's really interesting about the computer. And when you're talking about either layout like this or you're talking about fabrications, the computer does not care if it's a straight line or a curved line at all, right? It will try things that you don't normally try because it isn't based on the same set of rules that we have grown up with and evolved with, right? It doesn't have only straight edges. It doesn't only have 30, 60, 90, right? So there's some other examples. This is a tool called Finch, and it's under development right now, but you can see it's a completely responsive design just based on the outer walls of this module. You can see the furniture is changing, it's constantly calculating the area, and it's all rules based. So how many times we always start with just the outer shell. And what this is showing is you can actually have it all when you're doing that. And not only in 2D, but in 3D as well, right? So you're automatically building that three-dimensional model either for visualization or for BIM or whatever. And then his latest development, I think this is kind of interesting, it kind of shows how he's using generative design to automatically populate based on, again, like zoning setbacks in this case. Maybe there's some site constraints as far as like the bottom, what that bottom can be, but then also how tall can that thing be? What's your floor-to-floor height? You can see it's automatically labeling that. Once he has that information, automatically throwing the skin onto that building based on those rules. And so coming at this from like a prefab angle, if some prefab company is just building exterior wall panels, it's all calced, it's done, right? It's not done, but it's done enough to have a really good idea of what this thing could be and what it could cost. And it shows a client immediately what that could be like. So, I think that stuff's kind of exciting, and I think that those tools enable us to get to another place in our process much faster. It allows us to involve the participants in our process in a much more interactive way so that there's more ownership. There's a few other examples. High par is probably one that I'm really most excited about as far as creating a platform. So not just a tool, but an entire platform that HMC could even become an author in. And again, like the entire building like gets designed kind of all at the same time. So picking a site, doing volumes, doing facades, doing elevator cores. Again, all of that stuff is based on rules. And remember a few slides ago I said, you know, one of the things about what technology is allowing, this disintermediation, it's just encoding knowledge. And so what are the rules around core assemblies that can be encoded into an algorithm, and you never have to spend the time to lay it out again, right? Once it's encoded, maybe that code evolves a little bit over time as code changes, like the actual building code, but you have rules around structure, you have rules around floor-to-floor heights, you have rules around all that stuff, and it's automatically being applied as the building is kind of just being iterated upon. Kind of the last mind-blowing example here, in this case, is TestFit. TestFit is doing some really cool stuff. We've actually played with this here, but for those of you who haven't seen it before, it's a tool that is really for multifamily housing at its core, but it's developing into so much more than that. Generating schemes, doing pro formas, making sure that the thing that the developer in this case wants to build works, and then automatically applies cost to it. I think it's really incredible. And now I'm starting to think about this tool from like a prefab standpoint, right? If you're just talking about panelizing the exterior, all the rules are already there, right? As long as you know what that module is, you could force this to automatically comply with those rules for some kit of parts that you've already designed. And then automatically send that into your other tools that you use. So I think all of those, as far as like the AEC industry goes, are probably the most exciting things that we're seeing and could potentially be disruptive. For instance, that last example, TestFit, you know, it's $500 a month to do something like that. I mean, it didn't start out that way, but that's where it's at now with subscriptions, right? So do they care if you're an architect? No, they only care if you have $500 a month, right? They'll sell it to anybody who wants to design buildings or be a part of a process that is part of designing buildings. And you can now offer that as a service with this software. Who would rather lay out a building with all of those rules and stuff embedded into it rather than one line at a time or one block at a time, right? It's all calcing, it's all generating, it'll get you, let's just call it 95% of the way there in 5 seconds, right? As far as that part of the process goes. I think that is incredibly exciting. And it is the kind of thing to me that should not be seen as a barrier for us. It's more of an enabler so that we can work on more interesting problems, right? I think the architect's value in this kind of value chain is in the ideation. It is in the synthesis of all of the different constraints that we're hearing from the user groups and the administrative bodies and all the different people that we kind of have to navigate through this process. We're the ones who are adding that value at those points, but should we be spending all of our time laying out toilet rooms every time and parking lots every time and drawing the stairs and modeling all of that element by element every single time? Only if it's special is what I would say, right? And let this other stuff be handled by computers. That's what they're good for. So I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. Kind of went through that super fast, but I really felt like it would be cool to talk through some of this stuff. And what other things are you guys seeing? And I definitely want to open it up to you who have called in as well. If you would just unmute yourself individually.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So that chart that showed us down at the bottom,
Yeah.
to hunting,
Yeah.
it's saying that architecture, our industry, is like ripe for disruption, right? Because
Or ripe for innovation.
Right.
Yeah.
Ripe for innovation. So what do we do to not become like the incumbents? Is it using these tools so that, you know, and when I say we, I mean like HMC or a firm like this.
Right.
How do we not become the incumbent that one day will get knocked out by a disruptor?
Yeah, so I don't think we have to solve all of the world's problems all at the same time, but you have to pick something. And to me, it is probably a different business model, which is easy to say, hard to do, right? Especially when you operate with forecasts and the way that people are used to working. I think my position on that is finding a new avenue to go down that isn't serving the clients that we're currently serving, right? And so you're talking, one of the interesting statistics that I recently heard and kind of latched onto was that, and this is coming from multiple entities, so I tend to believe this, is that architects touch 1% of the built environment as far as overall quantity of buildings all around the world, right? You can look at the hillsides in Brazil covered by the shanties, and you can look at, it's all buildings, right? Architects, 1%. The other side of that factor is that the 1% of wealth in the world, it has 56% of all of the wealth. They're the ones buying the buildings, right? They're the ones who are actually financing this to happen, the stuff that we do. So we are the 1% working for the 1%. There's a very tiny sliver of what's out there. And so when you start to look at finding new clients who want to do different, they're not our clients, there's a huge landscape out there that we could be playing in, but we continue to kind of whittle down at that 1% for the 1%, and can we charge a little bit less, and can we do it a little bit faster? And I think that system eventually leads to like broken, if it isn't already. So just thinking about, I don't necessarily have an answer, but I don't think it could be that hard to come up with one that you could, or 5 that you could try, and try to do that, and try to do something differently than you've done it before, completely differently, and try to offer a new value that other people want and need and will pay for. And it doesn't have to be an expensive thing. It could be a cheap thing, and we could try to disrupt ourselves, honestly, instead of waiting for somebody else to do it.
Hey, Evan, this is George. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, Evan.
Hi.
I missed the beginning of your presentation, but I caught the last half hour or so. You showed that app called, I think you said it was called Finch, where they had that scale, that room was being modified, and different layouts were popping up, looked like a apartment or something like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we have a lot of clients that, including our biggest one, Kaiser, that do things like room templates and where they draw specific room layouts. And a lot of our efforts have been focused on, modular construction based on types of templated spaces. But I'm wondering if you think there's an application where instead of creating templates, we create the programming. And give them, develop a tool for the client that's looking for templates and say, hey, this is better because you can basically go through all different options and generate new options, but under those rules. So focus on the programming versus the drawings, which seems to be a trend.
Absolutely, George. I think that you hit on something really important there, and that, again, I think it is where the value of an architect is that I don't think that we will ever ultimately compete in the drawing space against contractors, for instance. Like, they build it, and especially in Phoenix, where you do a lot of work, right? It's all design build. And we can get away actually with drawing less because the subcontractors and the contractors are drawing more because they're going to build it. They're going to build it that way, right? You were at Gilbane, right? It's like, how many drawings in the architectural set just never even get eyeballs on them, right? But yet that's where we spend our time because we're contracted to do so, right? To draw all of these things. I really do think that our value is much more so in those early stages in this business model because we can affect those outcomes in such a better way than we do when we get embedded in the day-to-day of the drawings part of it. Especially seeing this kind of example right here, seeing the automated code check stuff that's happening with upcodes. You start to see how these little pieces are all starting to converge together, and they really are automating the minutia out of these things. And you can encode details into assemblies so that they're just there, they're part of that model. And you don't necessarily have to worry about drawing them every time. Of course, there's always going to be unique things, but that is typically a smaller percentage overall, and we could handle that. But I think you're onto something there, George. That would be something worth looking into, because it is early in the process where we can talk about all the constraints and all the rules and start to attach data to it that actually proves outcomes. Because I think one of the problems we have with templates is one size doesn't fit all. It doesn't matter, like orientation, energy. You start just flopping that thing on a site and it's not going to perform as well maybe as it will somewhere else. Whereas if you have the blocks that build that overall thing and you know it all works together because you can actually prove that with data, you might come up with some more interesting designs that are more responsive to their environments.
Also, this is cool, but isn't it also kind of scary? Because something like this, maybe it's in like, I don't know, generation 1 or whatever. But as like an architect, like licensed architect, there's value in, you know, what we do and our knowledge base. And ultimately, can't something like this many years from now start to replace what an architect does?
I think it can replace things that you do, but I also, again, will go back to that 99% and say there's a huge market out there that is completely untapped. And I'm not saying they have money to buy architecture, but you could mass produce well-designed spaces in architecture that could affect much more of the population, which I think would make a better population for the world who could do better things. If they had access to things like this. So if this is going to replace something that I do so that I can work on a bigger problem, okay, I'm okay with that. I could totally see how people are definitely scared of this stuff, but I think it's just a mindset shift. I really do think that there's so much work out there that we could be doing. We can't continue to limit it to that 1% of the 1%. Because in that model, it is scary. I just don't think that that necessarily has to be the model we choose to operate in the future.
I'd also add just slides and partner, like the machines don't know anything, right?
Right.
And
They know what you tell it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's still a place for our knowledge and our expertise, but like it's definitely going to impact how long you spend sitting there plugging away in Revit, right? Because production. But when you think about, it used to be you could have an architecture quiz long before any of our time. You could have an architecture career, you would just draw all day because you had a steady hand, because it took a whole team to draw a set with and spin the pencil just right. We don't have that anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's like AutoCAD is so much faster. Like Evan said, anybody can draw a neat line. So just being able to draw a neat line doesn't get your job. You have to know what you're drawing, right? And now we have Revit, and we've reduced the amount of drawings even more. But you have to know more to draw in Revit than you did in AutoCAD. You can't just be like, this is what I do.
Yeah. But I think that's changing, right? Because of automations and things, where things are starting to happen more automatically, and you just have to know foundational things, or I think it's shifting.
Yeah, I see this as like another step down that path, right? Like even more so, it becomes the abstract thought, the expertise, the knowing why you space a certain way, what the code is, what the ramifications are. So it probably changes the role, but at least until at this point in time, technology is not a threat to the creative process or the expertise.
Yeah.
I think this means that we as architects need to know more, actually, because if you're so there's a couple of thoughts I have. One is these things are controlled by the rules you input.
Yep.
So it takes discoverability out of the process, which is unfortunate from an architectural perspective.
Yep.
The other thing I think is we need to know more, because where we get caught all the time is where things come together, and this doesn't know that.
Yep.
And you can encode certain things into assemblies, but it's not that. It's very complex, and so there's
more complex all the time,
and
right?
more complex all the time. So there are points where if we just say, oh well, okay, I can do this, punch, punch, punch. That's cool, but if we don't invest in ourselves in terms of knowledge base, then we could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, and be like, shit, who knows how to build a wall?
Yeah.
Like, nobody.
Not us.
Not us.
The robots do.
Right? And that's a problem.